Hello and welcome to this video on gender, crime and justice. Women and girls generally commit less crime than men, and they commit different types of crime if we believe official statistics as provided by the government. Traditionally, male-dominated criminology, that is the study of crime and criminals, has neglected female criminality because their behaviour was not always seen as in need of control, and so the focus has generally been on men and male crime. Feminists, however, now focus on female criminality and have changed criminology overall. Sociologists have also begun to focus on male crime as a form of an expression of masculinity, so it's actually perhaps a resource by which men can prove their masculinity in a time when many sociologists are arguing that actually masculinity may be in crisis. Some sociologists and criminologists argue that official statistics cannot be trusted, and that the amount of female crime may in fact be wildly underestimated. They argue that female crimes, generally things such as property theft and prostitution, and by property theft we're really focusing here on shoplifting, are unlikely to be reported, unlike violent or sexual crime, which is often seen as more male crime. Why might this be the case? Well, if we think about it in terms of shoplifting, often the shoplifting is occurring in very large businesses, multinational corporations, perhaps supermarkets, where in fact these businesses expect to an extent that some things will be stolen, and they write off a certain amount against their insurance of the things that they might be losing, known as wastage. Moreover, when it comes to prostitution, we need to think about who exactly is going to be reporting prostitution outside of a, say, off-duty police officer who happens to catch a prostitute and a customer in the act. Because ultimately the customer, the person paying for the prostitute, is not going to be reporting themselves, let alone the prostitute's behaviour, and the prostitute's not going to be reporting their behaviour otherwise. So this may be why we see less of these statistics on the official crime statistics provided by the government in the British Crime Survey. When women's crimes are reported, however, they also tend to be less likely to be prosecuted or are let off lightly. And there's a whole range of theories as to why this might be the case. One such theory is the chivalry thesis. Chivalry is defined as courteous behaviour, especially that of a man towards women. Now, chivalry actually goes back many, many hundreds of years. It's a French knightly code. It was all about how knights should treat each other when they were on the battlefield. Now, today that has been somewhat transformed. We don't really have knights on battlefields anymore. Instead, it's more about, again, how men treat women and how they should be socialised to treat women and how they should respect women. An example of contemporary or modern day chivalry might be a man holding a door open for a woman to walk through. It's a very traditional viewpoint. One might even argue that it's rooted in patriarchy or sexism or misogyny. Others could argue that it's a romantic gesture in the modern age. The thesis argues that most criminal justice agents, such as the police, are men, and men are socialised to act in a chivalrous or honourable way towards women. That is, they almost want to care for or protect women. Therefore, the criminal justice system is more lenient with women, and so their crimes are less likely to end up in official statistics. This gives an invalid picture that exaggerates the extent of gender differences in rates of offending. Evidence from self-report studies suggests that female offenders are treated more leniently. Flood Page and others found that while only 1 in 11 female self-report offenders had been cautioned, the figure for males was 1 in 7 self-report offenders. So we have a discrepancy there. Women are also more likely than men to be cautioned rather than prosecuted. And for example, the Ministry of Justice found that 49% of females recorded as offending received a caution in 2007, whereas for males the figure was only 30%. So once again, we have another discrepancy. However, there may be arguments against the chivalry thesis. Farrington and Morris's study of sentencing of 408 offences of theft in a magistrates' court found that women were not sentenced more leniently for comparable offences. Broadly speaking, the sentences were roughly the same for both genders. If women appear to be treated more leniently, it may simply be because their offences are less serious. Furthermore, female offenders are more likely to show remorse, and this may help to explain why they are more likely to receive a caution instead of going to court. Some sociologists argue that there may in fact be a bias against women in the criminal justice system, and in particular, feminists put forward this idea. Heidenson argues that the courts treat females more harshly than males when they deviate from gender norms. We have in our society a double standard, unfortunately, whereby if young men engage in promiscuous sexual activity, this is seen as a positive thing, whereas if young women do the same thing, it's often viewed in a negative way, and they may attract verbal abuse as a result. Courts in fact punish girls but not boys for premature or promiscuous sexual activity, and girls can be placed in care for doing so. Women who do not conform to accepted standards of monogamous heterosexuality and motherhood are punished more harshly, therefore. Pat Carlin found and argued that when women are jailed, it is less for the seriousness of their crimes and more according to the court's assessment of them as wives, as mothers, and as daughters. So again, there appears to be a misogyny or sexism at the heart of these sorts of decisions. Feminists argue that these double standards exist because the criminal justice system is patriarchal, that is male-dominated, and Sandra Walkley argues that in rape cases, it is the victim that is on trial rather than the accused, and often the victim has to prove her respectability, to prove that she is not someone who is promiscuous, and only then will she be given the clemency that the court can provide. In terms of explaining female crime, there are a range of different potential explanations that we need to consider. Women in general seem to have a lower rate of crime when we look at official statistics, irrelevant of the chivalry thesis or an inbuilt bias. Going back to an almost pre-sociological age, many argued that perhaps there was a biological difference, and in particular, Lombroso and Ferrero, two Italian sociologists, anthropologists, argued that perhaps criminality is innate. So this is that nature versus nurture argument, and here they would be arguing for nature. They argued that there are less female-born criminals, and that perhaps higher levels of testosterone, the male hormone, leads to greater levels of offending. And so because women have less of this, they're less likely to offend. It's a rather controversial viewpoint that's generally somewhat outdated. And obviously as sociologists, we're interested more in the sociology than the biology of potential explanations regarding criminality. Our first key explanation, therefore, is functionalist sex role theory. And this is put forward by Parsons from the 1950s. And he traces differences in crime and deviance to the gender roles in the conventional nuclear family. It tends to be the boys that reject feminine models of behaviour that express emotion. Instead, boys distance themselves from such models by engaging in compensatory, compulsory masculinity, almost over-the-top masculine-style behaviours. Because men have much less of a socialising role than women in the nuclear family, socialisation can be more different for boys than for girls. So little girls growing up looking at mum, that socialisation seems a fairly sort of common and natural and straightforward trend. For little boys, however, looking up at their mum, they may feel, well, you're not male, I don't really know how I should be taking the socialisation you're giving me, perhaps I should be behaving in a different way, perhaps I should be engaging in compensatory, compulsory masculinity. Interestingly, Cohen argued the relative lack of an adult male role model means boys are more likely to turn to all-male street gangs as a source of masculine identity, so we can hark back there to subcultural strain theory. Neoliberal New Right theorists argue that the absence of a male role model leads to boys turning to criminal street gangs as a source of identity. So they're looking for a way to be themselves or to find an identity that they can latch onto when dad is not around. And again, this for neoliberals and the New Right and for functionalists is an example of why you need to have a good, strong breadwinner, male role model in the family who's going to act as someone to look up to for little boys. However, although the theory tries to explain gender differences in crime in terms of behaviour learned through socialisation, it is ultimately based on biological assumptions about sex differences. I mean, there's no reason to believe necessarily that little girls are naturally going to latch onto their mothers and see them as role models. They could be latching onto dad and seeing them as role models. And there's no reason why little boys could not be latching onto mum and seeing her as a role model versus a father. So the idea that there's somehow a socialisation meets biology issue here is somewhat problematic. So again, we need to distance ourselves from those sorts of arguments. Hydison argues that the most striking thing about women's behaviour is how conformist it is. They commit fewer crimes than men. They generally conform to a gender stereotype. In her view, this is because patriarchal society imposes greater control over women, and this reduces their opportunities to offend. So they simply just don't have the opportunities to go out and commit crime. Patriarchal control is exerted in three major areas. She identified firstly at the home. Women are generally expected to be homemakers, bringing up the kids, doing the cooking and cleaning, which keeps them busy and prevents them from being able to commit crime. Little girls also are generally expected to be at home, engaging in a bedroom culture with their friends when it comes to their leisure time. Otherwise, they should be perhaps helping mother. So again, no opportunity to commit crime. And when dad comes home or husband comes home, he's the main breadwinner, he's the main decision maker. And he may, in fact, for many feminists, be using forms of domestic violence or at the very least the threat of violence in order to maintain control in the home. In terms of controlling the public, women often feel that they can't go out late at night or they don't want to go places which are dark because they may be fearful of some sort of attack or sexual abuse or rape. So when they are in public, it's often going to be during daylight hours. They're either going to be in school or college or university as a young person, or perhaps as an older person. If they are perhaps married with kids, they'll be going out doing the shopping, possibly socialising with female kin. Again, very little opportunities to commit crime. Finally, in terms of work, most women, generally speaking, when they are in the workplace, will find that their bosses are likely to be male, and because of that, there's patriarchal control being exerted there. Arguably, the work environment is still seen as a male environment, and so there may be patriarchal norms that prevent women from being able to commit crime. Even when women do move up the ranks, it's very hard for them to commit crime, or arguably they cannot commit middle class or white collar crime because they find it harder to break the glass ceiling and get into those types of roles. Pat Carlin puts forward the concept of the class and gender deals, again as a form of control over women by patriarchal society, and again this might be an explanation for why they cannot commit crime. Carlin conducted a study of 39 50 to 46-year-old working class women who had been convicted for a range of crimes. Carlin argues that working class women are generally led to conform for the promise of two types of rewards or deals. So essentially, women do not commit crime if they come from working class backgrounds because they're told, right, you take up one of these two deals, that's your pact with society so that you don't commit crime. And essentially what Carlin is saying is when women do commit crime, it's because these two deals haven't come good, as it were. The class deal is that women who work will be offered material rewards. They will get a pay packet at the end of every month with a decent standard of living as a result and leisure opportunities. And for many women, this is enough to prevent them from committing crime. The gender deal, however, is the more sort of patriarchal product of ideology, which promises women material and emotional rewards from family life by conforming to the norms of a conventional domestic gender role. And again, if they do this, there's less opportunities available to them to be able to go out and commit crime generally. If these rewards are not available or worth the effort, crime becomes more likely. Carlin argues that this was the case with the women in her study. In terms of the class deal, the women had failed to find a legitimate way of earning a living, that is, having a job, and this left them feeling oppressed and the victims of injustice, hence they turned to crime. In terms of the gender deal for conforming to patriarchal family norms, most of the women had either not had the opportunity to make a deal, that is, they had not met someone, got married, settled down and had kids, or saw few rewards and in fact many disadvantages of family life and so decided to go elsewhere. Many of the women had reached the conclusion that crime was the only route to a decent standard of living and they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. So they'd done a cost-benefit analysis, looked at the deals and thought, not for me, and decided to turn to crime. In terms of evaluation, Heiderson shows the many patriarchal controls that prevent women from deviating, whilst Carlin shows how the failure of patriarchal society to deliver the promised deals to some women removes the controls that prevent them from offending, hence they commit crime. However, Carlin's sample was small and maybe unrepresentative, consisting as it did largely of working class and serious offenders. For Heiderson, there may be an argument to say that some of her ideas may somewhat be outmoded or outdated today, and perhaps they need to be reconsidered as a result. Frieda Adler argues that as women become liberated from patriarchy, their crimes will become as frequent and as serious as men's. Adler argues that changes in the structure of society has led to changes in women's offending and behaviour, for example, through greater opportunities in education because of a lack of patriarchal control. As a result, women now commit typically more male offences, such as white-collar crimes. This is because of women's greater self-confidence and assertiveness, and the fact that they now have greater opportunities in the legitimate structure, that is, they are moving up the hierarchy in the workplace and smashing the glass ceiling slowly but surely. However, the female crime rate actually began to go up long before the women's liberation movement, that is the 1950s, whereas the movement itself came out in the 1960s. Most female criminals are working class, the group least likely to be influenced by women's liberation, in fact, which has benefited middle-class women more. There is little evidence that the illegitimate opportunity structure of professional crime has opened up to women. It still seems to be a fairly male-dominated environment. However, Adler's thesis does draw attention to the importance of investigating the relationship changes in women's position and changes in patterns of female offending. However, it can be argued that she overestimates both the extent to which women have become liberated and the extent to which they are now able to engage in serious crime. We now need to focus on explaining male crime. Arguably, although criminologists have focused on male criminality, until recently they have not asked what it is about being male that leads men to offend. They just generally tended to assume that men were more likely to commit crime. The concept of masculinity may help us in trying to understand this. And here we're looking at the work of James Messerschmidt. Masculinity, he argues, is a social construct, something we've created, or an accomplishment which men have to constantly work at constructing and presenting and projecting. This is to say that simply by virtue of owning a penis, does not make a man masculine. Instead, a man has to work at and prove their masculinity, generally to their friends, their peers, or to wider society, by engaging in different behaviours or acting in a certain way. Messerschmitt identifies how there are a range of different masculinities that exist, but in particular he focuses on hegemonic masculinity, which is a form of masculinity which is dominant and is considered prestigious in our society and in most Western societies. It's made up of a number of different layers. Firstly, paid labour, so people who engage in hegemonic masculinity will be workers. They engage in the subordination of women. They seek to show their dominance over women, and they may do this whether verbally or potentially physically on some occasions. Heterosexuality, so being straight, very much part of this form of masculinity, as well as a sense of uncontrollable sexuality known as machismo. So they want to almost come across as if they are engaging in sexual behaviours quite regularly. Perhaps they are sexually promiscuous, or at the very least they're engaging in a healthy sexual relationship with their partner. Messerschmitt identifies how there are other masculinities which are subordinated to this hegemonic masculinity, such as homosexual men who would have no desire to accomplish hegemonic masculinity because they themselves are not heterosexual by virtue of being homosexual, and also they may not want to necessarily engage in, for example, the subordination of women. Also, some ethnic minority men may have a slightly different form of masculinity which may be subordinate also to hegemonic masculinity, and it may well be because they are more working class and may not therefore have the resources to aspire to be able to achieve hegemonic masculinity, which does require, through the virtue of paid labour, money in order to achieve. As a result, in particular for those subordinate masculinities or for people who are aspiring to hegemonic masculinity, crime and deviance is a resource some men may use to accomplish masculinity. It's a way of showing their masculinity, as it were, if for some reason simply having a job and simply trying to be sexually active isn't working. Masculinity is therefore affected by class and ethnicity, and it differs according to your access to certain resources, money in particular. So for white middle class youths in school, they will subordinate themselves to teachers, they will do as they're told, leading to accommodating masculinity. Whereas outside of school, they may therefore engage in an oppositional masculinity of pranks, drinking, vandalism, antisocial behaviour and so on, as a way of using crime and deviance as a resource to prove their masculinity whilst aspiring to hegemonic masculinity. Whereas white working class youths, there's less chance of educational success, leading again to an oppositional masculinity, a kind of laddishness with sexist attitudes. It's an attempt to try and achieve hegemonic masculinity without having that key cornerstone of paid labour or good paid labour that perhaps white middle class youths will be able to achieve later in life. Whereas perhaps black lower working class youths, they may, for example, once again, be frozen out of the middle class education system, therefore cannot achieve that way. So they may, for example, join an anti-school subculture, which may spill over into the outside world, and then gang membership may take place as a way of expressing masculinity. Property crime may be used to achieve material success. They may be seeking to gain status in an alternative status hierarchy. So what you're seeing here is middle-class men may use crime too, but it will be white-collar rather than the blue-collar crime. Crime and deviance can therefore be a resource, a way of proving one's masculinity in certain scenarios. However, does masculinity really explain crimes? It seems to argue that masculinity explains male crimes of violence because they are committed by males who have violent characteristics. Again, we get a bit of a circular biological argument here, which is somewhat problematic. We need to consider then why do not all men commit crime in order to prove their masculinity? The reality is most people don't commit crime, therefore most men don't commit crime. Most men arguably are fairly secure in their masculinity, whether it's hegemonic or otherwise. They don't seem to be using crime as a resource. So why is it only some? The concept of masculinity is arguably also overworked to fit all male crimes. I mean, we have to remember there are lots of different types of crimes out there. The idea that they're all being committed with a view to proving one's masculinity is perhaps somewhat far-fetched. Winlow argued there might be a relationship in terms of the move from modernity to post-modernity, masculinity and crime. Globalization has led to a shift from a modern industrial society to a late modern deindustrialized society here in the UK. This has led to the loss of many manual jobs, whilst there has been an expansion in the service sector, in particular jobs in bars and pubs. Winlow's study of bouncers in Sunderland, an area of deindustrialization and unemployment, found that working as bouncers in clubs provided young men with both paid work and the opportunity for illegal business ventures in drugs and alcohol, as well as the opportunity to demonstrate their masculinity through the use of violence. So they are engaging here in paid work, they're also doing some illegal activity on the side, perhaps selling drugs, but also proving their masculinity through violent behaviours. Winlow notes that in modern society there has always been a violent conflict subculture in Sunderland, in which hard men, to use the slang, earn status through their ability to use violence. However, the absence of a professional criminal subculture meant that there was little opportunity for a career in organised crime. And here we'll harken back to the work of Cloward and Olin. Winlow posits the concept of bodily capital to help explain this. Under postmodern conditions, an organised professional criminal subculture has emerged as a result of the new illicit business opportunities to be found in the nighttime economy, that is in pubs and clubs. In this subculture, the ability to use violence becomes not just a way of displaying masculinity, but a commodity with which to earn a living. The men use their bodily or physical capital to maintain their reputation. So for example, bouncers seek to develop their physical assets by bodybuilding, by working out, heavy lifting and so on. Winlow notes that this is not just a matter of being able to use violence and win fights, but of maintaining the sign values of their bodies, that is looking the part so as to discourage competitors from challenging them, both punters and also other bouncers. This reflects the idea that in postmodern society, signs take on a reality of their own, independent of the thing they supposedly represent. So being actually able to beat someone up, say, or be physically violent is as important as looking as if you can. Winlow's study shows how the expression of masculinity changes with the move from modern industrialised society to a postmodern de-industrialised one. At the same time, this opens up new criminal opportunities for men who are able to use violence to express masculinity, by creating the conditions for the growth of an organised criminal subculture. So again, by coming across as if you can use violence, that is a way of proving one's masculinity. Engaging in crime and deviance is a resource in order to become or show one's hegemonic masculinity. That's it. Thank you very much.